Hi, today I want to give you a brief history of the education in the United States, where we have come from in reading education, and where we currently are. So I know that as I give you this brief introduction, there are going to be many people that are like, why didn't she include them? And for the purposes of this, I wanted to be succinct and I wanted to really give an idea of the big players that are going on in each stage and kind of like the big ideology. So we really need to start in the 1800s. Horace Mann is often known as the father of education, of public education, and that's for good reason. Horace Mann in the 1800s believed that all children have the right to go to a school, a public school that is funded by taxes from the citizens. He also believed that religion should be removed from the schools and that this should not be a religious opportunity for children, that instead of focusing on religion, they should focus on a public education for all students. This is really different from what had happened before then, because before then, education was really private schools. And, you think about like they have like 17-year-old and 18-year-old girls that were being the teachers. There was no codified way of educating teachers. And so he advocated for all students having an education and for teachers having to go through a program to prepare them. He was also a proponent of the whole language movement, meaning that instead of asking children to do sound symbol correspondences, they should look at a word and they should memorize it by the whole unit. Now, it's important to note that in this time, we obviously did not have the benefits of scientific research. And so Horace Mann is really critical with doing the best with what we had at the time. So it's really interesting. In the 1930s, Samuel Orton and Anna Gillingham began doing Orton-Gillingham training. So Orton-Gillingham training is just as popular now, if not more so than it was almost a century ago. Orton-Gillingham is an explicit, systematic phonics instruction delivered to students. This is in direct contrast to Horace Mann. Horace Mann did not believe that we needed to educate all students in phonics, but Samuel Orton and Anna Gillingham, through their training, very specifically focused on that phonics component, especially for struggling dyslexic learners. In the 1955, Rudolph Flush published a book called Why Johnny Can't Read. And you know a book is going to be a good book if it hits the bestsellers list as an education book, right? Like education novels are not sitting there at the top of the New York Times bestseller. But this really did become kind of like an instant bestseller. And in this, he said that the reason why our children can't read is because of the whole language movement. He said that if we want our children to become proficient readers, we need to be able to teach them phonics. But then in 1967 comes along Ken Goodman. And if you know about Fountas and Pinnell, Lucy Calkins, Reading Recovery, all of their work is strongly rooted in the belief of Ken Goodman. Ken Goodman had a theory, and he published this theory, and he called it in part that reading is a psycholinguistic guessing game. This is really important because in the 1990s, balanced literacy came out. And today, there's a lot of attack on Ken Goodman's work, that it promotes guessing. And people will say this absolutely does not promote guessing in children. But we have to keep in mind that he literally called it a guessing game. And Ken Goodman believed this. He believed that when we are reading, we do not look at every letter, every word as we're reading. Instead, we use things like meaning and structure and syntax in order to make sense of what we see in front of us on the page. So this is very similar to the whole language movement. He promoted something called the three cueing systems, which was a big part of his theory. In the 1970s, based off of some of the work of Ken Goodman, Mari Clay from New Zealand began to develop Reading Recovery. Reading Recovery is a one-on-one tutoring program or tutoring intervention, for first graders. It has often been cited maybe as the gold standard of intervention for students, and it has been very important for a very long time. It is directly rooted in Ken Goodman's work. Now, at the same time that balanced literacy starts to rise, we're also seeing the rise of scientific research. And this is where the science of reading is emerging. Back in the 1800s with Horace Mann, we didn't have the privilege of scientific research. But now there are all these different fields, including cognitive psychology, educational psychology, all these different things that I will never be smart enough to understand. They are all doing research asking, okay, well, do we know anything about how children learn to read? And they are proving with science how children learn to read. I chose to highlight just one research, but this is truly almost 5 decades now worth of research coming out about how children learn to read. In 1989, there's eye scan research done by Rayner and Polacek. And they discovered with this eye scan movement research that, hey, we don't skip over words. When we're reading, we actually look at every single word that we're reading. So this disproves Ken Goodman's theory that we do not use every single word as we're reading. And that's what's so important about the science of reading, is we are able to give scientific proof to either prove or disprove some educational theories. But despite the fact that all of this research has been coming out, the 1990s saw the rise of balanced literacy. Balanced literacy is this notion that if you want your children to be a good reader, or you want your children to be good writers, what we have to do is treat them like readers and writers from the start. That's my definition of balanced literacy. There are other people who have different ones. One of the problems with balanced literacy is that there is no agreed upon definition. And so people can squabble over what is included. But the 3 cueing system is deeply rooted in balanced literacy. Leveled texts are a huge indicator that this is a balanced literacy program. So balanced literacy works off this notion that if we just treat them like readers and treat them like writers long enough, then they will become readers and writers. The teacher really does take a back seat and acts as this guide on the side. And intuitively, it kind of seems like it makes sense, right? Like, oh, well, yeah, just let them write. But it de-emphasizes systematic, explicit instruction in different components, including phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, vocabulary, those things. So then in 2000, amidst all this hullabaloo, Congress asked for the National Reading Panel to be convened, and they asked them to determine an answer to this question. Do we have enough research to say this is how children learn to read? Or does the research have kind of a consensus almost of what practices work best when teaching children how to read? And they came up with these 5 pillars that I'm sure that you've heard of, to include phonics, fluency, phonemic awareness, vocabulary, and comprehension. So there were subgroups, and each of the subgroups delved in, looked at all the available research up to that point to make a determination about how children learn to read. And if you read it, they really were able to find out what matters. And guess what? Systematic, explicit phonics instruction that teaches children how to make the sound symbol correlation has a proven track record. So all of those theories of Ken Goodman and Horace Mann, they have been disproven by research. And it is with the National Reading Panel that a lot of this was coming to light, because the truth is, as teachers, we're not scientists, right? Like, I'm not out there doing research. I'm certainly not out there paying for research articles. So the National Reading Panel was a time when research was made public in a very easy to understand way for the American people. There has been nothing that has been this large scale, sorry. This kind of an effort has not been done since, that's been funded by the government. Now, I'm skipping ahead all the way up to 2018 because I truly credit Emily Hanford with making the science of reading public. So up until then, lots of people were talking about it, but it wasn't until Emily Hanford released At a Loss for Words for Ed Week, which was both a podcast and an article, where she exposed the pitfalls of 3 cueing. I remember reading the article and being so mad. Like, how dare she? I was taught 3 cueing systems in college, and my college professors knew what they were talking about, right? And I think a lot of us had to come to terms with this information and with the science as a result of her 2019 article, and then also her 2023 release, Sold a Story. So, over the past couple of hundred years, education has changed. We have gone from a society that did not really know how children were learning to read, and we didn't really even give all children the opportunity to learn how to read. And then we had butting heads against people who thought kind of like Ken Goodman did, and then people who thought kind of like Orton Gillingham did, right? And now, though, we have science to guide us. And that is what's really important is that the science is guiding us in order for us to figure out best practices for students. So I hope that this was helpful for you. I hope that maybe I taught you one or two things that you hadn't known before about education. Thank you so much for listening.